Picture this. A man stands before a tribunal of the most powerful religious authority in the world, forced to renounce everything he believes to be true about the universe itself. The year is 1633, and Galileo Galilei, now 69 years old and nearly blind, faces a choice that will echo through history. Deny the evidence of his own eyes, the calculations of his own mind, and the revolutionary discoveries that have consumed his life, or face the fires of the Inquisition. But how did we get here? How did a brilliant mathematician and inventor become the most dangerous man in Europe? The answer lies in a story of genius, ambition, and the courage to challenge everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the cosmos. Before we dive into this extraordinary journey, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Your support means everything, and I'm genuinely curious about the global community joining us for this exploration of one of history's most fascinating figures. Now settle back as we travel to the 16th century Italy, to the birth of a man who would literally move the earth and shake the heavens themselves. This is the complete life of Galileo Galilei, and it begins not with telescopes or trials, but with the simple curiosity of a young boy who dared to question everything. Galileo Galilei was born on February 15th, 1564, in Pisa, a city already famous for its leaning tower, but about to become even more renowned for the man who would conduct experiments from its heights. The world into which Galileo entered was one of rigid certainty, where the earth sat motionless at the centre of creation and the heavens moved in perfect, unchanging circles around it. Aristotle's physics had dominated thinking for nearly 2,000 years, and the Catholic Church had woven these ancient Greek ideas into the very fabric of Christian doctrine. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a musician and mathematician, a man who understood both the beauty of harmony and the precision of numbers. Vincenzo was part of a group known as the Florentine Camerata, musicians and intellectuals who were revolutionizing music by moving away from the complex polyphonic style of the Middle Ages towards something more expressive and natural. This spirit of innovation, this willingness to challenge established traditions, would flow through the family bloodline like a powerful current. The Galilei family was comfortable but not wealthy, part of the minor nobility that lived on the edges of true power. Galileo was the eldest of 6 children, and from his earliest years, he displayed the kind of restless intelligence that both delighted and worried his parents. While other children played with toys, young Galileo was taking them apart to understand how they worked. He showed an early fascination with mechanical devices, building elaborate contraptions that demonstrated an intuitive grasp of engineering principles. But there was something else about the boy that set him apart. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. When he watched a lamp swinging in the cathedral during Mass, while others were focused on prayer, Galileo was timing its oscillations with his pulse, discovering that the period of the swing remained constant regardless of the amplitude. This observation, made when he was just a teenager, would later lead to his invention of the pendulum clock and revolutionise timekeeping forever. His education began at the local monastery of Vallombrosa, where the monks taught Latin, Greek, and the fundamentals of logic and rhetoric. But Galileo's mind was already wandering beyond the prescribed curriculum. He was fascinated by the works of Archimedes, the ancient Greek mathematician who had discovered the principles of buoyancy and leverage. While his classmates struggled with basic geometry, Galileo was exploring the mathematical relationships that governed everything from falling bodies to floating objects. In 1581, at the age of 17, Galileo entered the University of Pisa to study medicine, following his father's practical wish that his son pursue a profession that would provide financial security. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. During his first year, Galileo attended a lecture on geometry by the court mathematician Ostilio Ricci. Something ignited in that lecture hall. The beauty and logical consistency of mathematical proof captivated him in a way that the memorization of medical texts never could. Against his father's wishes, Galileo began attending mathematics and natural philosophy lectures in secret. He devoured the works of Euclid and Archimedes, spending hours working through proofs and exploring mathematical relationships. His professors quickly recognized his exceptional talent, but his father remained resistant to his son's change of academic direction. Mathematics, Vincenzo argued, was a pursuit for wealthy gentlemen, not for someone who needed to earn a living. The tension between passion and practicality came to a head when Galileo's family could no longer afford his university fees. In 1585, without completing his degree, he left the University of Pisa and returned home to Florence. But this apparent setback would prove to be the making of him. Free from the constraints of formal education, Galileo began to develop his own approach to understanding the natural world. He started giving private mathematics lessons to support himself, quickly gaining a reputation as a brilliant teacher who could make complex concepts accessible and exciting. His students were drawn not just to his knowledge, but to his method. Unlike other teachers who relied on rote memorization and ancient authorities, Galileo encouraged his students to observe, experiment, and think for themselves. During this period, Galileo made his first significant scientific discovery. He invented what he called the hydrostatic balance, a device for determining the specific gravity of objects by weighing them in water. This invention brought him to the attention of influential patrons and established his reputation as both a theoretical mathematician and a practical inventor. But it was his study of motion that would truly set him apart from his contemporaries. Aristotle had taught that heavy objects fall faster than light ones, a conclusion that seemed logical and had been accepted without question for centuries. Galileo began to doubt this fundamental assumption. Through careful observation and mathematical analysis, he developed a new understanding of how objects move through space. He discovered that, in the absence of air resistance, all objects fall at the same rate regardless of their weight. This insight flew in the face of everything the learned men of his time believed about physics. When he attempted to demonstrate this principle, the reaction was swift and hostile. How dare this young man, without even a university degree, challenge the wisdom of Aristotle, whose works formed the foundation of all natural philosophy? But Galileo was undeterred. He had discovered something more powerful than ancient authority, the method of experimental science. He realized that nature herself was the ultimate arbiter of truth, and that careful observation and mathematical analysis could reveal her secrets. This approach would become the cornerstone of modern scientific method and would ultimately transform humanity's understanding of the universe. In 1589, his growing reputation earned him an appointment as professor of mathematics at his old university in Pisa. He was just 25 years old, younger than many of his students, but his lectures quickly became the most popular on campus. He brought a revolutionary approach to teaching, emphasizing demonstration and logical argument over mere recitation of classical texts. His colleagues, however, were less enthusiastic about his methods. The university was a bastion of Aristotelian orthodoxy, and Galileo's challenges to established doctrine made him powerful enemies. When he demonstrated that objects of different weights fall at the same speed, traditionalists accused him of trickery or claimed that the experiments were irrelevant to true philosophical understanding. The most famous of these demonstrations, whether it actually occurred or has been embellished by legend, supposedly took place at the Leaning Tower of Pisa. According to the story, Galileo dropped 2 spheres of different masses from the tower's height before a crowd of professors and students. When both spheres hit the ground simultaneously, the audience was stunned, but rather than embracing this new knowledge, many dismissed it as an anomaly or accused Galileo of some form of deception. This reaction revealed something profound about the nature of established knowledge and human resistance to change. Galileo was not just challenging a scientific theory, he was threatening an entire worldview that had provided certainty and meaning for generations. The implications of his discoveries reached far beyond physics into theology, philosophy, and the very foundations of human understanding. Despite the hostility he faced, Galileo continued his research into the nature of motion. He studied projectiles, discovering that they follow parabolic paths through the air. He investigated pendulums, noting their remarkable properties of isochronism. Each discovery built upon the last, creating a new mathematical framework for understanding how objects move through space and time. His work on motion would eventually culminate in his formulation of the principle of inertia, the idea that objects in motion tend to remain in motion unless acted upon by an external force. This insight would later become the foundation for Newton's first law of motion, but in Galileo's time, it was a revolutionary departure from Aristotelian physics, which held that all motion required a constant force to maintain it. But even as Galileo was revolutionizing physics, larger forces were stirring that would soon sweep him into an even more dramatic confrontation with established authority. In 1543, Nicholas Copernicus had published his theory that the Earth moves around the Sun, but this idea had remained largely a mathematical curiosity, discussed among scholars but not seriously challenging the Church's geocentric worldview. That was about to change. In the early years of the 17th century, new discoveries and new instruments would provide Galileo with the tools to transform Copernican theory from mathematical hypothesis into observable reality. The stage was being set for a conflict that would reshape not just astronomy, but humanity's entire conception of its place in the cosmos. As we'll see in our next installment, Galileo's journey was about to take a dramatic turn. A simple tube with lenses would become the instrument that would allow him to peer into the heavens and discover worlds that no human had ever seen before. But with those discoveries would come dangers that would threaten not just his career, but his very life. Very life. The year 1592 brought both opportunity and uncertainty to Galileo's life. His contract at the University of Pisa was not renewed, largely due to his controversial teachings and his growing reputation as a troublemaker among the Aristotelian establishment. At 28, he found himself once again without steady employment. But this apparent setback would prove to be another disguised blessing. Word of his brilliance had reached Venice, and the prestigious University of Padua offered him the chair of mathematics. Padua was part of the Venetian Republic, a cosmopolitan centre of trade and learning that prided itself on intellectual freedom and independence from papal authority. The salary was significantly better than what he had earned in Pisa, and the atmosphere promised to be far more conducive to his revolutionary approach to natural philosophy. The move to Padua marked the beginning of what Galileo himself would later call the best 18 years of his life. Here he was free to pursue his research without the constant interference of conservative colleagues. The university attracted students from across Europe, eager minds hungry for new knowledge and unafraid of challenging old assumptions. Galileo threw himself into his work with renewed vigour. His lectures on mathematics and astronomy drew packed audiences, not just from the university, but from the broader intellectual community of Venice. He had developed a teaching style that was part performance, part scientific demonstration, and entirely captivating. Unlike other professors who droned through ancient texts, Galileo made mathematics come alive, showing his students how numbers and geometry could unlock the secrets of the natural world. But teaching alone could not satisfy his restless intellect. During his Padua years, Galileo became as much inventor as he was mathematician. His workshop became a laboratory where theoretical insights were transformed into practical devices. He developed an improved compass for military engineers, a device that could calculate everything from artillery trajectories to currency exchange rates. This invention proved so successful that he set up a small manufacturing operation, training craftsmen to produce the instruments while he focused on design and improvements. The compass brought him both income and fame, but more importantly, it established his reputation as someone who could bridge the gap between abstract mathematics and real-world application. Princes and merchants sought his advice on engineering problems, while scholars travelled from distant universities to discuss his latest theories about motion and mechanics. It was during this period that Galileo began his systematic study of acceleration and falling bodies. Working in his private laboratory, he conducted hundreds of experiments, rolling bronze balls down inclined planes and timing their descent with water clocks of his own design. These experiments were marvels of precision and ingenuity, designed to isolate specific variables and eliminate sources of error. What he discovered through these painstaking investigations would fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of motion itself. He found that falling objects accelerate at a constant rate, regardless of their weight or composition. More remarkably, he discovered that the distance travelled by an accelerating object is proportional to the square of the time elapsed. These insights, expressed in elegant mathematical formulas, revealed that the universe operated according to precise mathematical laws, rather than the vague qualitative principles that had dominated natural philosophy for millennia. But Galileo's personal life, during this period, was as complex as his scientific work. In 1600, he began a relationship with Marina Gamba, a young Venetian woman from a modest background. Their relationship, while never formalized in marriage, would span more than a decade and produce 3 children: 2 daughters, Virginia and Livia, and a son, Vincenzo. The decision not to marry was likely practical rather than romantic. As a university professor and member of the minor nobility, Galileo moved in social circles where marriage to someone of Marina's background would have been problematic. Yet their relationship appears to have been genuine and affectionate, and Galileo took seriously his responsibilities as a father, even as the illegitimate status of his children would create complications throughout their lives. His daughters Virginia and Livia would eventually enter religious life, taking the names Sister Maria Celeste and Sister Arcangela, respectively. Virginia, in particular, would become one of her father's closest confidants, their correspondence revealing a relationship of remarkable warmth and intellectual companionship. She shared her father's curiosity about the natural world and served as both emotional support and practical advisor during his later troubles. Meanwhile, Galileo's scientific reputation continued to grow. His work on motion had attracted the attention of Johannes Kepler, the brilliant German astronomer who was developing his own revolutionary theories about planetary motion. The 2 men began a correspondence that would prove crucial to the development of modern astronomy, though they would never meet in person. Kepler had been working to refine the Copernican model of the solar system, and his mathematical analysis had led him to conclude that planets move in elliptical rather than circular orbits. This insight resolved many of the problems that had plagued earlier heliocentric theories, but it also departed even further from the ancient belief in the perfection of circular celestial motion. Galileo was intrigued by Kepler's work, but remained cautious about fully embracing the Copernican system. While his experiments with motion had convinced him that Aristotelian physics was fundamentally flawed, the question of whether the Earth actually moved through space required different kinds of evidence. The mathematics was elegant, but where was the proof that human senses could detect? The answer would come from an unexpected source. In 1608, word reached Italy of a remarkable new invention created by Dutch spectacle makers. By combining lenses in a tube, craftsmen had created a device that could make distant objects appear much closer and larger. The invention was being called a spyglass or telescope, and its potential applications for military surveillance and navigation were immediately obvious to the practical Venetians. But Galileo saw something else entirely. Within days of hearing about the telescope, he had constructed his own version, improving upon the Dutch design through his superior understanding of optics and mathematics. His telescope could magnify objects 8 times, far better than the crude Dutch instruments, and he immediately recognized its revolutionary potential. The Venetian Senate was impressed enough by his demonstration to grant him a substantial raise and lifetime tenure at the university. But Galileo had already glimpsed a far more significant application for his improved telescope. If this instrument could make distant ships appear close, what might it reveal about the distant stars and planets? On a clear evening in late 1609, Galileo pointed his telescope skyward and became the first human being to see the universe as it truly is. What he observed through that simple tube of lenses would shatter forever the ancient conception of the heavens as perfect, unchanging, and fundamentally different from the earthly realm. The moon, that symbol of celestial perfection, revealed itself to be a world much like Earth, covered with mountains, valleys, and what appeared to be vast plains. The Milky Way, that faint band of light across the night sky, resolved into countless individual stars, suggesting that the universe was far larger and more populated than anyone had imagined. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. When Galileo turned his telescope toward Jupiter, he found that the giant planet was not alone. 4 smaller objects moved around it in regular patterns, sometimes visible on one side, sometimes on the other, sometimes hidden behind the planet itself. These were moons, worlds orbiting another world, providing direct evidence that not everything in the universe revolved around the Earth. Night after night, Galileo tracked these Jovian satellites, mapping their motions and confirming that they followed the same mathematical laws that governed earthly mechanics. Here was proof that the Copernican system was not just mathematical convenience, but physical reality. If Jupiter could have its own system of orbiting bodies, then surely the Earth could orbit the Sun. In March 1610, Galileo published his findings in a short book titled Sidereus Nuncius, or The Starry Messenger. The work created an immediate sensation across Europe. Here was observational evidence that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had previously imagined. Scholars, nobles, and clergy all clamoured to look through telescopes and see these celestial wonders for themselves. But even as Galileo basked in his newfound fame, darker forces were beginning to stir. The implications of his discoveries extended far beyond astronomy into the very foundations of religious and philosophical thought. If the Earth was just one planet among many, if the heavens were filled with worlds upon worlds, what did this mean for humanity's special place in God's creation? The Catholic Church, already dealing with the Protestant Reformation and challenges to its authority, now faced a new threat from an unexpected quarter. The man who had once been content to study falling balls and swinging pendulums had become the herald of a new cosmic order, one that placed humanity not at the center of creation, but on a small world circling an ordinary star in an infinite universe filled with countless other stars and worlds. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the centuries, a battle between the new science of observation and mathematics against the ancient certainties of tradition and authority. Galileo Galilei, armed with his telescope and his unwavering commitment to following the evidence wherever it led, was about to become the most dangerous man in Europe. The publication of the Starry Messenger transformed Galileo from a respected professor into an international celebrity almost overnight. Letters poured in from across Europe, from princes and cardinals, from fellow mathematicians and curious nobles, all desperate to understand these revelations that seemed to rewrite the very structure of creation itself. The Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo II de' Medici, was so impressed that he offered Galileo a position as his court mathematician and philosopher, freeing him from teaching duties and providing him with the resources to pursue his research full-time. The decision to leave Padua was not easy. The Venetian Republic had been good to him, offering intellectual freedom and protection from Roman interference. But the lure of returning to Florence, of having unlimited time for research, and of the prestige that came with a ducal appointment proved irresistible. In 1610, at the age of 46, Galileo accepted the position and prepared to leave the safety of Venice for the more politically treacherous waters of Papal Italy. His Venetian friends warned him about the move. The Inquisition held far more sway in Florence than in the independent Republic of Venice, but Galileo, intoxicated by his discoveries and confident in the power of evidence to convince reasonable men, dismissed these concerns. Truth, he believed, would ultimately triumph over prejudice and ignorance. It was a faith that would soon be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The early years in Florence seemed to vindicate his optimism. The Medici court welcomed him with enthusiasm, and he continued making discoveries that further supported the Copernican model of the universe. Through his telescope, he observed that Venus showed phases like the moon, waxing and waning in a pattern that could only be explained if it orbited the sun. He watched the dance of sunspots across the solar surface, providing evidence that even the sun itself rotated on its axis. Each new observation was another nail in the coffin of the old astronomy. The universe revealed by Galileo's telescope bore no resemblance to the perfect, unchanging celestial realm described by Aristotle and enshrined in church doctrine. Instead, it was a dynamic place where worlds moved through space, where celestial bodies showed the same kinds of changes and imperfections found on Earth, where the fundamental unity of terrestrial and celestial physics was becoming undeniable. But not everyone was pleased with these revelations. In 1613, Father Benedetto Castelli, one of Galileo's former students, wrote to his mentor about a troubling incident at the Medici court. During a breakfast discussion, the Grand Duchess Christiana had raised concerns about the compatibility of Copernican astronomy with Holy Scripture. Certain biblical passages seemed to clearly state that the sun moved across the sky while the earth remained fixed. How could a faithful Christian accept theories that appeared to contradict the Word of God? Galileo's response to this challenge revealed both his brilliance and his dangerous naivety about the political realities he faced. In a long letter to Castelli, later expanded into his famous letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, he argued that Scripture and science could never truly conflict, because both came from God. When apparent contradictions arose, he suggested, it was because Scripture used metaphorical language suited to common understanding, while science revealed the literal truth about God's creation. This argument, while theologically sophisticated, was politically explosive. Galileo was essentially claiming that scientists, not theologians, were the proper interpreters of God's works in nature. He was suggesting that when Scripture and scientific observation conflicted, it was Scripture that should be reinterpreted. For an institution that had spent centuries establishing its exclusive authority to interpret divine revelation, this was nothing short of revolutionary heresy. The letter circulated widely among intellectuals and clergy, creating a firestorm of debate. Some admired Galileo's attempt to reconcile faith and reason, but others saw it as an attack on the very foundations of religious authority. Dominican friars in Florence began preaching against him from the pulpit, denouncing him as a dangerous innovator who sought to undermine Christian faith with pagan philosophy. The controversy reached Rome, where Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, one of the most respected theologians of his time, was asked to evaluate the situation. Bellarmine was no ignorant fanatic. He was a learned man who understood the mathematical elegance of Copernican theory. But he also understood the theological and political implications of accepting it as physical truth rather than mere mathematical hypothesis. In 1615, Father Paolo Antonio Foscarini published a book explicitly defending the compatibility of Copernican theory with Scripture. The work was immediately placed on the index of prohibited books, and Bellarmine wrote a carefully worded letter explaining the Church's position. Copernican theory could be used as a mathematical tool for calculating planetary positions, but it could not be taught as physical reality without conclusive proof. And such proof, Bellarmine argued, did not yet exist. Galileo, confident in his discoveries and his rhetorical skills, decided to travel to Rome personally to defend his position. He arrived in the Eternal City in December 1615, armed with his telescopes and his conviction that he could convince the church hierarchy of the truth of his discoveries. It was a fateful decision that would set in motion the events leading to his eventual trial and condemnation. The Roman intellectual scene was more complex than Galileo had anticipated. While some cardinals and prelates were genuinely interested in his discoveries, others viewed him with deep suspicion. His reputation as a brilliant but arrogant man who delighted in making fools of his opponents preceded him. The subtle art of Roman politics required diplomacy and deference to authority, qualities that had never been Galileo's strengths. During his months in Rome, Galileo held numerous meetings and demonstrations, showing church officials the wonders visible through his telescope. Many were impressed by what they saw, but few were willing to accept the theological implications of these observations. The gap between admiring the cleverness of an instrument and accepting a revolutionary cosmology proved wider than Galileo had imagined. The situation came to a head in February 1616, when the Congregation of the Index formally condemned Copernican theory as false and contrary to Scripture. Copernicus's own work was suspended pending corrections, while Foscarini's book was banned outright. Cardinal Bellarmine summoned Galileo for a private meeting, the exact details of which would later become a source of crucial controversy. According to Bellarmine's account, he gently warned Galileo not to hold or defend Copernican theory as true, but allowed that he could discuss it as a mathematical hypothesis. Galileo left the meeting believing he had been treated fairly, and that he retained considerable freedom to continue his research. But a document later found in the Inquisition files suggested that he had been given a much stricter injunction, forbidding him from teaching or discussing Copernican theory in any form. Whether this document was authentic or fabricated would become a central question in Galileo's later trial, but for now, he returned to Florence believing that he had weathered the storm. He continued his astronomical observations, discovered the puzzling triple nature of Saturn through his telescope, which lacked the resolution to clearly show its rings, and maintained correspondence with scholars across Europe. For several years, an uneasy peace prevailed. Galileo avoided explicit advocacy of Copernican theory while continuing his scientific work. He studied comets, investigated the nature of heat and cold, and developed his thoughts on motion and mechanics. But the fundamental questions raised by his telescopic discoveries remained unresolved, simmering beneath the surface of apparent accommodation. The election of Cardinal Maffeo Barberini as Pope Urban VIII in 1623 seemed to offer new hope. Barberini was a cultured, intellectual man who had previously shown interest in Galileo's work, and had even written a poem celebrating his discoveries. Surely a pope who appreciated learning and natural philosophy would prove more sympathetic to scientific truth than his predecessors. Galileo travelled to Rome for 6 audiences with the new pope, coming away convinced that he had been given tacit permission to write about Copernican theory, provided he treated it hypothetically rather than as established fact. This interpretation of papal approval would prove to be another dangerous miscalculation, but for now, it filled Galileo with optimism about the future. He returned to Florence and began work on what would become his masterpiece and his downfall: Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. The book would take him nearly a decade to complete, and when it was finally published in 1632, it would trigger the confrontation that had been building for 20 years. The man who had once simply wanted to understand how objects fall and pendulums swing was about to face the full power of the Roman Inquisition in a trial that would determine not just his own fate, but the future relationship between science and religious authority for centuries to come. Centuries to come. The decade Galileo spent writing his dialogue was marked by a deceptive calm, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. He worked methodically, crafting what he believed would be his definitive contribution to natural philosophy. The book took the form of a conversation between three characters: Salviati, representing the Copernican view; Simplicio, defending Aristotelian and Ptolemaic astronomy; and Sagredo, an intelligent layman asking probing questions. On the surface, the structure seemed to satisfy the Church's requirements. Galileo presented both sides of the astronomical debate, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions. But anyone reading carefully could see where the author's sympathies lay. Salviati's arguments were elegant and compelling, backed by mathematical reasoning and telescopic evidence. Simplicio's defences of the old astronomy appeared increasingly weak and ridiculous as the dialogue progressed. The choice of names was itself provocative. While Salviati honoured Galileo's deceased friend, Filippo Salviati, and Sagredo commemorated another departed companion, the name Simplicio carried unfortunate connotations. Though ostensibly derived from the ancient commentator Simplicius, contemporary readers would inevitably hear echoes of simpleton. The character defending church-approved astronomy was being subtly mocked from the very beginning, but Galileo's most dangerous miscalculation was putting one of Pope Urban VIII's favourite arguments into the mouth of Simplicio. The Pope had often argued that while human reason might favour one astronomical system over another, God in his omnipotence could achieve any observed effects through means beyond human understanding. This argument for divine omnipotence appeared in the dialogue's final pages, spoken by the character whose foolishness had been demonstrated throughout the entire work. Whether Galileo intended this as a deliberate insult or simply failed to recognise its implications, the result was catastrophic. When the dialogue was published in February 1632, it quickly became clear that he had crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. The book's immediate reception seemed promising. Educated readers across Europe were fascinated by its clear presentation of astronomical arguments and its masterful Italian prose. Unlike most scientific works written in Latin for scholarly audiences, the dialogue was accessible to anyone with basic education. This accessibility was itself revolutionary, democratizing complex astronomical knowledge that had previously been confined to university circles. But in Rome, reactions were far different. Church officials who had initially approved the manuscript for publication began to realize they had been deceived. The book was supposed to present both astronomical systems neutrally, but its actual effect was to make Copernican theory appear obviously superior. Worse still, Galileo had included detailed discussions of tidal motion, presenting the movement of Earth's oceans as proof that the planet rotated and orbited the Sun. This argument about tides revealed another aspect of Galileo's character that would prove problematic: his refusal to acknowledge the limitations of his own knowledge. Johannes Kepler had already proposed that lunar gravity might explain ocean tides, but Galileo dismissed this idea as mystical nonsense. He insisted that tides resulted from Earth's combined rotational and orbital motions, like water sloshing in a moving bucket. This mechanical explanation appealed to his mathematical sensibilities, but it was fundamentally wrong. Galileo's certainty about tidal causation demonstrated both his brilliance and his blind spots. He could revolutionize physics and astronomy through careful observation and mathematical analysis, but he could also become irrationally attached to elegant theories that fit his preconceptions. This intellectual stubbornness would make compromise impossible when church authorities demanded that he moderate his claims. By August 1632, sales of the dialogue had been suspended pending investigation. A special commission was appointed to examine the work and determine whether its author had violated the 1616 injunction against teaching Copernican theory. The commissioner's report was damning. Galileo had clearly advocated heliocentrism rather than merely presenting it as hypothesis. Moreover, they claimed to have found evidence that he had been explicitly forbidden from discussing Copernican theory in any form. The discovery of the 1616 document in Inquisition files created a legal crisis. If authentic, it proved that Galileo had been given a strict prohibition that he had blatantly violated. If forged, it suggested that church officials were manufacturing evidence against him. Modern scholars remain divided about the document's authenticity, but in 1632, its existence provided legal grounds for prosecution. Pope Urban VIII felt personally betrayed. He had trusted Galileo, granted him audiences, even allowed him to dedicate the dialogue to the papal court. The realization that his favourite argument had been placed in the mouth of a fool seemed to confirm his worst suspicions about the astronomer's true intentions. Personal humiliation combined with theological concern to create an explosive mixture of papal anger. The political context made Galileo's situation even more precarious. The 30 Years' War was devastating Europe, with Catholic and Protestant armies fighting for both territorial and religious supremacy. The Church could not afford to appear weak or divided in the face of Protestant challenges to papal authority. An Italian scientist publicly contradicting biblical interpretation while claiming church approval presented exactly the kind of scandal that enemies of Rome would exploit. In September 1632, Galileo received a summons to appear before the Roman Inquisition. The document was politely worded but carried unmistakable implications. He was ordered to present himself in Rome within 30 days to answer charges of heresy. At 68 years old, suffering from arthritis and other ailments, he faced the prospect of travelling in winter to confront the most feared tribunal in Christendom. Galileo's initial response was to seek delay through medical exemptions. 3 physicians certified that travel would endanger his health, but Roman officials were unmoved. The Inquisition had waited 16 years since the initial controversy. They would not be deterred by claims of illness. When diplomatic pressure from the Tuscan court also failed to provide relief, Galileo realized he had no choice but to comply. The journey to Rome in January 1633 was a nightmare of winter travel and growing dread. Galileo stayed at the Tuscan embassy rather than in Inquisition prisons, a courtesy extended due to his advanced age and diplomatic intervention. But this small comfort could not disguise the gravity of his situation. The same city that had once welcomed him as a celebrated scientist now received him as a suspected heretic. The preliminary interrogation took place on April 12, 1633, in the Inquisition's chambers near St. Peter's Basilica. The elderly scientist faced a panel of 10 cardinals, men who held his fate in their hands. The questions focused on the 1616 meeting with Cardinal Bellarmine and the exact nature of the prohibition Galileo had received. His responses were carefully crafted to minimize his culpability while acknowledging the authority of the Church. Galileo claimed that he had been told only not to hold or defend Copernican theory, leaving him free to discuss it hypothetically. He insisted that the dialogue presented both sides of the astronomical debate fairly, though he admitted that Copernican arguments might appear stronger due to his superior skill in presenting them. This explanation satisfied no one. It was too clever by half, and the commissioners could see through its transparent evasions. The trial that followed was both a legal proceeding and a symbolic confrontation between two worldviews. On one side stood Galileo, representing the new science of observation and mathematical analysis. On the other stood the Inquisition, defending traditional authority and the Church's exclusive right to interpret divine revelation. Neither side fully understood the historical significance of their conflict, but both sensed that fundamental principles were at stake. The outcome was never really in doubt. Galileo faced a choice between recantation and execution, and despite his courage in pursuing scientific truth, he was not prepared for martyrdom. The man who had spent his life studying the laws of motion was about to discover the immutable law of institutional power. When individual genius confronts organized authority, authority usually wins. But even as the trial moved toward its inevitable conclusion, Galileo's ideas continued to spread across Europe. The dialogue had already been translated and circulated in Protestant countries where papal authority held no sway. The seeds of the scientific revolution had been planted, and no Inquisition tribunal could prevent their eventual flowering. The question now was whether their planter would survive to see them grow. The final act of this cosmic drama was about to unfold in a Roman courtroom, where an old man's words would echo through the centuries and transform humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. But first, he would have to choose between truth and survival, between the evidence of his eyes and the demands of faith, between the cosmos revealed by his telescope and the world sanctioned by religious authority. The proceedings against Galileo unfolded with the methodical precision of a machine designed to extract submission rather than truth. Each session followed carefully choreographed rituals that had been perfected over centuries of papal justice. The accused would be led into chambers where shadows seemed to gather in the corners, despite the afternoon sun streaming through high windows. Cardinals in scarlet robes sat behind an imposing wooden table, their faces masks of ecclesiastical authority. But beneath the formal courtesies lay currents of genuine uncertainty. The Church found itself in an unprecedented position. Never before had they faced a defendant whose ideas were spreading so rapidly across Europe, whose discoveries were being confirmed by observers in Protestant lands beyond papal reach. The traditional methods of suppressing dangerous ideas through intimidation and censorship were proving inadequate against this new form of knowledge that could be verified by anyone with the proper instruments. Cardinal Francesco Barberini, the Pope's nephew and a member of the tribunal, privately struggled with the implications of the case. He had seen Jupiter's moons through Galileo's telescope during the astronomer's earlier visits to Rome. The evidence was undeniable that these celestial bodies orbited the giant planet just as Galileo claimed. Yet acknowledging this simple fact seemed to open a door to consequences that terrified the Church hierarchy. The second interrogation on April 30th revealed the psychological pressure building within both sides. Galileo appeared more haggard, his usual confidence replaced by the careful wariness of a man who finally understood the forces arrayed against him. His interrogators pressed him on specific passages from the dialogue, reading aloud sections where Salviati's arguments for Earth's motion were particularly compelling. When confronted with his own words, Galileo attempted a defense that was both ingenious and pathetic. He claimed that in writing the dialogue, he had been so focused on making Copernican arguments appear strong that he had inadvertently made them too convincing. This explanation pleased no one. The commissioners saw through it immediately, while Galileo himself must have felt the bitter irony of being forced to claim incompetence in his life's greatest work. The technical discussions during these sessions revealed the intellectual sophistication of both sides. These were not ignorant fanatics persecuting a lone scientist, as later propaganda would suggest. Cardinal Bellarmine had been dead for over a decade, but his successors included men of genuine learning who understood astronomy and mathematics. They grasped the elegance of Copernican theory, even as they feared its implications for church authority. Father Christoph Scheiner, a Jesuit astronomer who had discovered sunspots independently of Galileo, served as one of the technical consultants to the tribunal. His relationship with Galileo was complicated by years of priority disputes and personal animosity, but his expertise was unquestioned. Scheiner had observed the same celestial phenomena that convinced Galileo of Earth's motion, yet he remained committed to finding ways to reconcile these observations with geocentric astronomy. The discussions between Scheiner and other church astronomers during the trial reveal the genuine intellectual struggle taking place behind closed doors. They were not simply defending ignorance against enlightenment, but wrestling with the practical problem of maintaining institutional authority while acknowledging scientific evidence that seemed to undermine established doctrine. Meanwhile, outside the tribunal chambers, Galileo's supporters worked frantically to save him. The Grand Duke of Tuscany dispatched his most skilled diplomats to negotiate with papal officials. Letters arrived from prominent intellectuals across Europe, praising Galileo's contributions to knowledge and pleading for merciful treatment. Even some within the church hierarchy privately urged moderation. But these efforts were undermined by Galileo's own previous statements and actions. His letter to the Grand Duchess Christina was circulated among the cardinals, reminding them of his claim that scientists should be the ultimate arbiters of natural truth. His mocking tone toward opponents in various writings was catalogued and presented as evidence of his arrogant disrespect for authority. The accumulated weight of years of intellectual combat had created too many enemies for diplomatic intervention to overcome. The most dramatic moment of the trial came on May 10th, when Galileo was brought before the tribunal for what he believed would be his final interrogation. Instead, he was informed that he would be given one last opportunity to confess his errors voluntarily. The alternative, though not explicitly stated, was clear to everyone present. The Inquisition's methods for extracting confessions from reluctant heretics were well known throughout Europe. Galileo's response to this ultimatum revealed both his courage and his human limitations. He had spent his entire adult life in pursuit of truth, following evidence wherever it led, regardless of conventional wisdom or established authority. But faced with the prospect of torture and execution, he discovered that his commitment to abstract principles had bounds. The man who had revolutionized humanity's understanding of motion was about to experience his own moment of inertia, where external forces would overcome his natural tendency to continue in his chosen direction. The confession he offered was a masterpiece of calculated ambiguity. He acknowledged that in writing the dialogue, he might have made Copernican arguments appear stronger than he had intended. He claimed that vain ambition and ignorance had led him astray, causing him to exceed the bounds of proper discussion. But he carefully avoided admitting that Copernican theory was actually false, instead suggesting only that his presentation of it had been inappropriate. This verbal dance satisfied neither Galileo nor his judges completely, but it provided a face-saving formula that both sides could accept. The Church could claim that the famous astronomer had confessed his errors and submitted to ecclesiastical authority. Galileo could tell himself that he had not betrayed the truth, merely acknowledged that his advocacy for it had been imprudent. The final sentencing took place on June 22, 1633, in the Dominican convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva. The same hall where Giordano Bruno had been condemned 33 years earlier now witnessed another confrontation between scientific thought and religious orthodoxy. But unlike Bruno, who had chosen martyrdom rather than recantation, Galileo would bend rather than break. The sentence was read aloud in Latin, its formal phrases echoing through the stone chamber. Galileo was found guilty of vehement suspicion of heresy for holding and defending the opinion that the earth moves around the sun. The dialogue was banned, and its author was sentenced to indefinite imprisonment at the pleasure of the Inquisition. All copies of the book were to be confiscated and destroyed wherever found. Then came the moment that would echo through history. Galileo, now 69 years old and broken by months of interrogation and uncertainty, was required to read aloud his formal abjuration. Kneeling before the assembled cardinals, he renounced the Copernican theory as false and contrary to Scripture. He promised never again to hold or defend such opinions, and called upon all faithful Christians to reject these dangerous errors. The words must have felt like ashes in his mouth. This was the man who had discovered the moons of Jupiter, who had observed the phases of Venus, who had mapped the surface of the moon and tracked the dance of sunspots across the solar disk. Now he was publicly declaring that all these observations meant nothing, that the evidence of his own eyes and instruments was subordinate to the authority of men who had never looked through a telescope. Legend claims that as he rose from his knees after the recantation, Galileo muttered under his breath, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. Whether this defiant whisper actually occurred is debated by historians, but the story captures something essential about the moment. Physical submission to authority could not change the fundamental nature of reality. The Earth continued its stately orbit around the Sun, regardless of what tribunals might declare or scientists might be forced to recant. The immediate aftermath of the trial revealed the complex emotions of all involved. Pope Urban VIII, having achieved his goal of public submission, commuted Galileo's prison sentence to house arrest. The astronomer would spend his remaining years confined to his villa outside Florence, forbidden from leaving without permission, but allowed to continue his non-astronomical research under strict supervision. Some cardinals privately expressed relief that the confrontation was over, while others worried that the Church's victory might prove Pyrrhic. Reports were already arriving from Protestant countries where Galileo's condemnation was being used as evidence of Catholic obscurantism and hostility to learning. The trial that was meant to demonstrate papal authority over dangerous ideas was instead becoming a symbol of institutional resistance to scientific progress. For Galileo himself, the return to Florence brought a mixture of relief and profound sadness. He was alive, which had been far from certain just weeks earlier, but his public humiliation weighed heavily on a man who had spent his career building an international reputation for intellectual courage and independence. The villa that became his prison held memories of happier times when visitors had come to marvel at his discoveries rather than to monitor his compliance with church directives. His daughter Virginia, now Sister Maria Celeste, became his primary source of emotional support during these dark months. Her letters reveal a woman of remarkable strength and intelligence, someone who understood both her father's genius and his human frailties. She managed his household, corresponded with his supporters, and provided the daily companionship that kept him from falling into complete despair. But even in defeat and confinement, Galileo's mind remained active. The same restless curiosity that had driven him to point his telescope skyward now turned to other problems in natural philosophy. If he could not discuss astronomy, he would explore the fundamental principles of motion and mechanics that had fascinated him since his youth in Pisa. The Inquisition had silenced his voice on cosmic questions, but they could not stop him from thinking about the earthly physics that might someday explain celestial motions. The scientific community across Europe watched these developments with a mixture of horror and fascination. Galileo's fate served as a warning to others who might challenge established authority, but it also demonstrated the power of ideas to transcend individual persecution. His telescopic discoveries could not be undiscovered, his arguments could not be unthought. The Church had won a battle, but the war between observation and authority was far from over. As 1633 drew to a close, Galileo settled into the routine of his house arrest, unaware that his greatest work still lay ahead. The man who had been forced to deny the motion of the Earth was about to embark on a final investigation into the nature of motion itself, one that would establish him as the father of modern physics, even as his astronomical theories remained officially condemned. The cosmic drama that had begun with a young professor dropping weights from the Leaning Tower of Pisa was entering its final act, and the greatest discoveries were yet to come. Yet to come. The villa at Arcetri, perched on the hills overlooking Florence, became both sanctuary and prison for the broken astronomer. From his study windows, Galileo could see the dome of the cathedral where he had once timed the swing of that fateful lamp as a young man. The irony was not lost on him that the same city which had nurtured his curiosity now held him captive for following that curiosity too far. But if the Inquisition believed they had crushed the spirit of inquiry, they gravely underestimated the man they had humbled. Within months of his return to Arcetri, Galileo was deep in work on what would become his most important scientific contribution. Unable to write about the heavens, he turned his attention back to the earthly realm of motion and mechanics that had first captured his imagination decades earlier. The project that emerged from his confinement was extraordinary in both its scope and its defiance of his circumstances. While officially forbidden from discussing astronomy, Galileo began composing a comprehensive treatise on the science of motion itself. The work would eventually be published as Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations relating to two new sciences, though getting it published would require elaborate subterfuge and international smuggling operations worthy of a spy novel. Sister Maria Celeste proved invaluable during this period, serving not only as emotional support, but as a practical collaborator in her father's work. She copied manuscripts, managed correspondence with foreign scholars, and even helped devise codes for communicating dangerous ideas without attracting the attention of church censors. The depth of their intellectual partnership is revealed in their surviving letters, which show a remarkable relationship between a brilliant father and an equally brilliant daughter whose gender and religious vocation had denied her the formal education she clearly deserved. The two new sciences that Galileo explored in his final masterwork were the strength of materials and the motion of projectiles. These might seem like mundane engineering problems compared to the cosmic questions that had brought him fame and persecution, but they represented something far more significant: the foundation of modern physics itself. His investigation into the strength of materials began with practical questions about why beams break under load and how to design structures that could withstand stress. But as always with Galileo, practical problems led to fundamental insights about the mathematical nature of physical reality. He discovered that the strength of a beam is proportional to the square of its dimensions, a finding that would prove crucial for future engineering and architecture. More revolutionary still was his systematic analysis of projectile motion. Building on his earlier work at Padua, Galileo demonstrated that the path of any projectile through the air follows a precise mathematical curve called a parabola. This might seem obvious to modern readers familiar with physics textbooks, but in Galileo's time, it was a stunning revelation that terrestrial motion could be described with the same mathematical precision that astronomers used for celestial bodies. The implications were profound and dangerous. If earthly motion followed mathematical laws, then perhaps celestial motion did as well. if projectiles moved in predictable parabolic paths, then perhaps planets moved in predictable elliptical orbits. The same mathematical principles that governed falling stones might govern falling comets. Galileo was laying the groundwork for a unified physics that would eventually demolish the artificial distinction between terrestrial and celestial realms. But the most remarkable aspect of this work was its method. Galileo had developed what we now recognize as the experimental method of science, though he would never have used that term. He designed ingenious experiments to isolate specific variables, used mathematical analysis to interpret his results, and then tested his conclusions against further observations. This approach was so novel that most of his contemporaries struggled to understand what he was doing. His study of falling bodies exemplified this revolutionary methodology. Using inclined planes to slow down the motion enough for accurate measurement, timing the descent with water clocks of his own design, and repeating experiments hundreds of times to ensure accuracy, Galileo discovered that falling objects accelerate at a constant rate regardless of their weight. This finding contradicted not only Aristotelian physics, but common sense itself, yet the mathematical evidence was undeniable. The work proceeded slowly, interrupted by periods of illness and depression that reflected both his advanced age and the psychological toll of his persecution. Some days Galileo could barely see the manuscript pages due to the progressive blindness that was claiming his sight. Other days, arthritis made writing so painful that he had to dictate to assistants, yet he persevered, driven by the same compulsive curiosity that had led him to point his first telescope at the moon. His international correspondence during this period reveals a man still engaged with the broader scientific community despite his isolation. Letters arrived secretly from scholars across Europe, reporting new discoveries and asking for his opinion on theoretical questions. Johannes Kepler wrote from Germany, sharing his latest insights about planetary motion. French mathematicians sought his advice on problems of ballistics and engineering. Dutch lens makers sent him improved telescopes that he could no longer legally use for astronomical observation. The irony of Galileo's situation was that his house arrest had actually enhanced his scientific reputation in Protestant countries where papal authority held no sway. The trial had transformed him from a brilliant but controversial Italian professor into an international martyr for scientific freedom. Universities in England, Germany, and the Netherlands competed to claim intellectual descent from the persecuted astronomer, while Catholic institutions found themselves embarrassed by association with his condemnation. This growing international reputation created practical problems for church authorities who had hoped that silencing Galileo would end the controversy surrounding his ideas. Instead, the trial had amplified interest in his work and created a powerful narrative of science versus religious authority that would influence European intellectual development for centuries. The Inquisition had achieved a tactical victory while suffering a strategic defeat that would undermine church credibility long after Galileo's death. Meanwhile, the astronomer himself was struggling with the personal costs of his choices. Letters to friends reveal a man haunted by regret, not for his scientific discoveries, but for the political miscalculations that had led to his downfall. He repeatedly expressed bewilderment at how his attempts to serve both science and faith had been interpreted as attacks on religious authority. The naive optimism that had led him to believe reason could overcome prejudice had been shattered by harsh experience with institutional power. His relationship with his son Vincenzo became increasingly strained during this period. Unlike his daughters, who had found peace in religious life, Vincenzo struggled with the social stigma attached to his family name. Employment opportunities were limited for the son of a condemned heretic, and his attempts to distance himself from his father's reputation created painful tensions within the household. The brilliant man who had revolutionized humanity's understanding of the cosmos found himself unable to heal the divisions within his own family. Yet even as personal sorrows accumulated, Galileo's scientific work continued to flourish. His analysis of pendulum motion led to insights about timekeeping that would eventually revolutionize navigation and astronomy. His studies of musical harmony revealed mathematical relationships that connected physics with aesthetics in ways that anticipated later developments in acoustics and wave theory. Each discovery built upon previous insights, creating a comprehensive mathematical framework for understanding the physical world. The problem of getting his final work published required elaborate international conspiracies that read like a Renaissance thriller. Since no Catholic printer would dare publish the work of a condemned heretic, manuscripts had to be smuggled across borders to Protestant publishing houses. The Dutch publisher, Louis Elsevier, finally agreed to produce the book, but even then, elaborate precautions were necessary to protect everyone involved from potential retaliation. As 1637 dawned, Galileo was putting the finishing touches on what he sensed would be his final major work. The man who had once been the toast of European courts was now a blind, arthritic prisoner whose greatest discoveries lay scattered across secret manuscripts hidden from church censors. But those manuscripts contained insights that would transform human understanding of physical reality and establish the mathematical foundation for all future science. The cosmic drama that had begun with a young man questioning why objects fall was approaching its climax. Galileo Galilei, now 73 years old and nearly blind, was about to complete the work that would secure his place as the father of modern physics. But first he would have to survive long enough to see his final masterpiece reach the wider world, carrying his ideas far beyond the reach of any inquisition or papal decree. The old astronomer could no longer see the stars he had once mapped with such precision, but his mind remained as sharp as the lenses that had first revealed the moon's mountains and Jupiter's dancing satellites. The greatest discoveries of his life were about to escape the confines of his hillside prison and begin their own journey through space and time, carrying the seeds of scientific revolution to every corner of the known world. Every corner of the known world. By 1638, the elaborate conspiracy to publish Galileo's final work was reaching its climax. The manuscript for his discourses on two new sciences had been secretly copied and smuggled piece by piece across the Alps to Holland, where Louis Elsevier waited with printing presses ready. The operation required the coordination of merchants, diplomats, and sympathetic clergy who understood that they were participating in something far more significant than mere book publishing. The irony was exquisite. While church authorities congratulated themselves on having silenced the dangerous astronomer, his most revolutionary ideas were being transformed into permanent form in the workshops of Protestant printers. The same institutional power that had forced his recantation was now inadvertently ensuring that his insights would survive long after both persecutor and persecuted had returned to dust. Galileo's blindness had become nearly complete by this time, yet his mental faculties remained remarkably sharp. He dictated corrections and additions to assistants, his mind still capable of the intricate mathematical reasoning that had revolutionized natural philosophy. The cruel irony that the man who had opened humanity's eyes to the true structure of the universe could no longer see his own hand was not lost on visitors who came to pay their respects to the fallen giant. Among these visitors was John Milton, the young English poet who would later write Paradise Lost. Milton's account of meeting Galileo provides a haunting picture of the astronomer in his final years. Here was a man who had discovered new worlds circling Jupiter, yet was now confined to a single villa. He had mapped the surface of the moon, yet could no longer see his own garden. He had proven that the Earth moved through space, yet was himself trapped in an ever-shrinking circle of permitted movement. The publication of the Discourses in 1638 created an immediate sensation across Protestant Europe. Here was the condemned heretic's final testament, a work that demonstrated conclusively that mathematics could unlock the secrets of physical motion with unprecedented precision. The book was smuggled back into Catholic territories within months, copied by hand when printed editions could not be obtained, passed from scholar to scholar despite the risks involved. What made the work so revolutionary was not just its specific discoveries, but its methodology. Galileo had created a new way of investigating nature that combined mathematical reasoning with controlled experimentation. Instead of relying on ancient authorities or logical arguments alone, he showed how careful observation and mathematical analysis could reveal universal laws governing physical phenomena. His analysis of projectile motion was particularly significant. By proving that cannonballs and arrows follow parabolic paths determined by precise mathematical formulas, Galileo demonstrated that earthly motion was as predictable and law-governed as the celestial motions that astronomers studied. The artificial distinction between terrestrial and celestial physics was crumbling, paving the way for Newton's later synthesis that would unite all motion under a single theoretical framework. The work on the strength of materials was equally groundbreaking. Galileo's investigation into why beams break under load led him to discover scaling laws that govern the relationship between size and strength in all structures, from cathedral spires to animal bones. These insights would prove crucial for the engineering advances that would transform European civilization over the following centuries. But perhaps most important was Galileo's systematic approach to the problem of motion itself. His careful analysis of acceleration, his discovery that objects fall at constant rates regardless of weight, his mathematical description of pendulum motion. These insights laid the foundation for what would become classical mechanics. Future physicists would build upon his work to create a comprehensive understanding of how objects move through space and time. The reception of the Discourses revealed the growing divide between Catholic and Protestant approaches to natural philosophy. In countries where papal authority held sway, the book was banned and its readers risked prosecution. But in Protestant lands, it was hailed as a masterpiece of mathematical reasoning and experimental method. Universities in England, Holland, and Germany began incorporating Galileo's insights into their curricula, training a new generation of natural philosophers who would carry forward his revolutionary approach. Meanwhile, at Arcetri, Galileo continued to receive visitors despite his official status as a prisoner of the Inquisition. These meetings had to be carefully managed to avoid giving church authorities grounds for further persecution, but they provided the aging scientist with crucial intellectual stimulation. Young scholars made pilgrimages to learn from the master, carrying away not just specific knowledge, but inspiration to continue the work of mathematical natural philosophy. The conversations during these visits often turned to questions that Galileo could no longer pursue directly. What lay beyond the planets he had discovered around Jupiter? How far did the universe extend? Were there other worlds, like Earth, circling distant stars? These speculations had to remain private, since any public discussion of cosmic questions would violate the terms of his house arrest. But the ideas continued to develop, passed along through whispered conversations and coded correspondence. His relationship with his daughter Virginia remained the brightest aspect of these dark years. Sister Maria Celeste's letters reveal a woman of extraordinary intelligence and compassion, someone who understood both her father's greatness and his human frailties. She managed his household affairs, maintained his correspondence with the outside world, and provided the emotional support that kept him from falling into complete despair. When Virginia died suddenly in 1634, just a year after the trial, Galileo was devastated. He had lost not only a beloved daughter, but his closest intellectual companion and most trusted advisor. Her death marked the beginning of a gradual withdrawal from active engagement with the world, though his scientific curiosity remained undiminished until the very end. The final years brought a parade of physical ailments that reflected both his advanced age and the psychological toll of his persecution. His eyesight continued to deteriorate until he was completely blind. Arthritis made movement painful and writing impossible. Yet his mind remained clear, and he continued dictating observations and theoretical insights to assistants who struggled to keep pace with his still active imagination. Foreign visitors during this period reported mixed impressions of the famous prisoner. Some found him bitter and broken, a once great man reduced to shadow of his former self. Others were struck by his continued intellectual vitality, his ability to discuss complex mathematical problems with the same precision that had characterized his earlier work. Perhaps both impressions were accurate, reflecting the complex reality of the extraordinary mind trapped in a failing body under impossible circumstances. The question of Galileo's true beliefs during these final years remains one of the great mysteries of scientific history. Had he genuinely abandoned his conviction that the Earth moved around the Sun, or was his public recantation merely a strategic retreat that allowed him to continue his work in other areas? His private correspondence suggests that he never truly abandoned the Copernican worldview, but he was careful never to express these beliefs in ways that could be used against him. What seems clear is that the trial had taught him painful lessons about the relationship between truth and power. The naive optimism that had led him to believe that compelling evidence would inevitably triumph over prejudice had been replaced by a more sophisticated understanding of how institutional authority operates. He had learned that being right was not enough if you lacked the political skill to present your insights in ways that powerful people could accept. Yet even this hard-won wisdom could not diminish his fundamental commitment to the pursuit of knowledge. Despite blindness, despite house arrest, despite the constant threat of further persecution, Galileo continued to investigate the natural world with the same passionate curiosity that had driven him since youth. The man who had revolutionized astronomy was spending his final years revolutionizing physics, laying groundwork for discoveries that would transform human understanding long after his death. As 1640 approached, it became clear that Galileo's extraordinary life was nearing its end. The body that had climbed countless stairs to observatories, that had bent over telescopes during cold nights mapping celestial wonders, that had conducted thousands of experiments with falling balls and swinging pendulums, was finally failing. But the mind that had conceived a new way of understanding physical reality remained active until the very last, still questioning, still calculating, still marveling at the mathematical harmony underlying the apparent chaos of natural phenomena. The cosmic drama that had begun with a curious young man timing pendulum swings in a cathedral was approaching its final scene. But the ideas generated during that remarkable lifetime were just beginning their own journey through history, destined to inspire countless future generations of scientists, philosophers, and anyone who dared to look up at the night sky and wonder about humanity's place in the vast universe beyond. The winter of 1641 brought an unusual visitor to the villa at Arcetri. Evangelista Torricelli, a young mathematician who had been following Galileo's work from afar, arrived with a letter of introduction and a mind brimming with questions about atmospheric pressure and the behaviour of liquids in confined spaces. What he found was a blind old man whose intellectual fire still burned with remarkable intensity despite the accumulated weight of persecution and physical decline. Torricelli had come seeking guidance on problems that would eventually lead him to invent the barometer, but the conversations that ensued ranged far beyond atmospheric phenomena. Here was perhaps the last student who would learn directly from the master, and Galileo seemed to sense the significance of this final teaching opportunity. Despite his blindness and failing health, he spent hours explaining the mathematical principles underlying his discoveries, passing along not just knowledge, but a way of thinking about the natural world. The young visitor was struck by Galileo's continued enthusiasm for problems of motion and mechanics. Even confined to his villa and forbidden from discussing astronomy, the old astronomer's mind remained as restless and probing as ever. He would gesture with trembling hands as he described the trajectory of projectiles, his sightless eyes seeming to track invisible parabolas through the air. When discussing the behavior of pendulums, he would tap out rhythms on his chair arm, his body still keeping time with the mathematical harmonies he had discovered decades earlier. But Torricelli also witnessed the profound sadness that had settled over Galileo's final years. The man who had once commanded audiences of princes and cardinals now received visitors in a modest study whose windows looked out on gardens he could no longer see. His great telescopes gathered dust in corners, their lenses clouded with age and neglect. The instruments that had revealed Jupiter's moons and Saturn's mysterious appendages were now mere curiosities in a house that had become both museum and prison. The correspondence that continued to arrive from across Europe provided some consolation. Letters came from France, where René Descartes was developing his own mathematical approach to natural philosophy, building on foundations that Galileo had established. Reports arrived from England, where young scholars at Cambridge and Oxford were studying the discourses and applying its insights to new problems in mechanics and astronomy. Each letter was evidence that his ideas were spreading far beyond the reach of any inquisition, taking root in minds that would carry the work forward. Yet there was also bitter irony in these international accolades. The man being celebrated across Protestant Europe as the founder of mathematical physics remained officially a condemned heretic in his own Catholic homeland. Students at the University of Padua, where he had spent his happiest years, were forbidden from reading his works. The academy in Florence that bore the Medici name could not acknowledge the greatest scientist their patronage had ever supported. The institutional memory of Catholic scholarship was being deliberately purged of one of its most brilliant contributors. Galileo's relationship with his surviving son Vincenzo remained complicated and painful. The young man struggled with the burden of his father's reputation, finding doors closed to him throughout Catholic Europe due to his family name. Their conversations were stilted affairs, marked by unspoken resentments and mutual incomprehension. Where the father saw the pursuit of truth as the highest calling, the son saw only the practical consequences of defying authority. The generational divide reflected larger tensions between old certainties and new knowledge that were reshaping European civilization. The daily routine at Arcetri followed patterns established during the early years of house arrest. Mornings were devoted to dictation as Galileo continued work on minor treatises and extensive correspondence. His assistant struggled to keep pace with thoughts that remained remarkably clear and systematic despite his physical infirmities. He would pause frequently to work through calculations in his head, his lips moving silently as he manipulated numbers and geometric relationships with the same facility that had astonished colleagues throughout his career. Afternoons brought visitors when church authorities permitted them, though these meetings required careful orchestration to avoid any appearance of scientific conspiracy. Conversations had to remain focused on approved topics, avoiding any direct discussion of astronomical questions that might be interpreted as violations of his sentence. Yet within these constraints, remarkable exchanges still occurred as Galileo shared insights about mathematics, engineering, and natural philosophy with the next generation of investigators. The progression of his blindness followed a cruel trajectory that seemed designed to maximize suffering. First, his ability to observe celestial objects disappeared, cutting him off from the discoveries that had defined his career. Then his capacity for reading was lost, severing his connection to the broader world of scholarship, except through assistants who read aloud. Finally, even the ability to see faces was taken away, leaving him to navigate relationships through voice and touch alone. Yet even in this darkness, Galileo's mind continued generating insights about the physical world. He developed new thoughts about the nature of light itself, speculating about whether it travelled instantaneously or required time to cross vast distances. These ideas could not be published or even discussed openly, but they represented the same fearless curiosity that had driven him to point his first telescope skyward. The man who could no longer see was still thinking about the fundamental nature of vision. His health began deteriorating more rapidly as 1641 progressed. The arthritis that had plagued him for years worsened, making movement increasingly painful. A persistent fever developed that seemed to sap his remaining strength. Yet he continued working, driven by an awareness that time was running short, and important insights might be lost if not properly recorded. His assistants found themselves taking dictation from a man who sometimes had to pause mid-sentence to catch his breath. The approaching end brought unexpected clarity about what truly mattered in his extraordinary life. The honours and condemnations, the papal audiences and Inquisition trials, the international fame and local persecution, all of these seemed less significant than the simple joy of understanding how the natural world operated. In his final months, Galileo returned repeatedly to the basic questions that had first captured his imagination as a young student. Why do objects fall? How do pendulums swing? What mathematical relationships govern motion through space? News of his declining condition began circulating through the international community of natural philosophers. Letters arrived expressing gratitude for his contributions and hope for his recovery, though everyone understood that the greatest scientific mind of the age was approaching its final calculations. The irony was not lost on his correspondents that the man who had discovered the laws governing celestial motion was now subject to the same biological laws that governed all earthly creatures. On January 8, 1642, as winter winds rattled the windows of the villa at Arcetri, Galileo Galilei died peacefully in his sleep. He was 77 years old, having lived through nearly 8 decades that had witnessed the transformation of human understanding about the cosmos and humanity's place within it. The man who had been born into a world where Earth sat motionless at the centre of creation died in a universe that he had proven to be far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had previously imagined. The immediate aftermath of his death revealed the complex legacy of his life and work. Church authorities, still viewing him as a dangerous heretic, initially forbade any public funeral or monument. His body was quietly interred in a small chapel at the Church of Santa Croce in Florence, without the elaborate ceremonies typically accorded to men of his stature and achievement. The institutional memory of the Catholic Church was not ready to acknowledge what history would eventually recognise as one of the greatest intellects in human civilization. Yet even as official silence surrounded his death, underground networks of scholars and students ensured that his ideas continued spreading across Europe. Copies of his work circulated secretly in Catholic territories while being openly celebrated in Protestant lands. The mathematical methods he had pioneered were being applied to new problems by investigators who understood that they were participating in a fundamental transformation of human knowledge. The scientific revolution that Galileo had helped launch was gaining unstoppable momentum. In England, a young Isaac Newton was beginning the work that would synthesize Galilean mechanics with Keplerian astronomy into a comprehensive theory of universal gravitation. In France, mathematicians were developing new techniques for analyzing motion and change that would eventually become calculus. Across Protestant Europe, Universities were establishing experimental natural philosophy as a legitimate field of study, training students in methods that Galileo had pioneered. The cosmic drama that had begun with a curious young man questioning ancient authorities about falling objects was entering its next act. The ideas that had cost their originator his freedom and reputation were now free to evolve and multiply, carried forward by minds that understood they were building upon foundations laid by a giant. Galileo Galilei was dead, but the revolution in human understanding that he had initiated was just beginning its transformation of civilization itself. The news of Galileo's death travelled slowly across the winter roads of Europe, carried by merchants and scholars who understood they were bearing word of a profound loss to human knowledge. In Protestant universities from London to Uppsala, professors paused their lectures to acknowledge the passing of the man who had fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with the cosmos. But in Catholic territories, official silence prevailed, as if pretending the great astronomer had never existed might somehow undo the revolutionary implications of his discoveries. The villa at Arcetri fell into an eerie quiet after the funeral. Servants moved through rooms that still contained the remnants of a lifetime devoted to understanding the natural world. Telescopes stood like silent sentinels in corners, their brass fittings tarnished with age and neglect. Manuscripts lay scattered across tables, covered with calculations that would have challenged the greatest mathematicians of the age. The workshop where Galileo had crafted his instruments resembled an abandoned laboratory, tools and unfinished devices bearing witness to experiments that would never be completed. Vincenzo faced the difficult task of managing his father's estate, while navigating the political sensitivities surrounding the family name. Church authorities remained suspicious of any attempt to glorify the condemned heretic, making it dangerous to preserve too obviously the materials that documented his scientific achievements. Many letters and manuscripts were quietly destroyed to protect those mentioned in the correspondence from potential persecution. The systematic erasure of evidence began almost immediately, as if the Inquisition hoped to eliminate not just the man, but any trace of his dangerous ideas. Yet this campaign of institutional forgetting was doomed from the start. Copies of Galileo's major works had already spread too widely to be completely suppressed. Students across Protestant Europe were learning mathematics from textbooks that incorporated his insights about motion and mechanics. Craftsmen were building instruments based on designs he had perfected. Engineers were applying his discoveries about the strength of materials to construction projects, from Amsterdam to Stockholm. The ideas had achieved a life independent of their creator, multiplying and evolving in ways that no authority could control. The irony of the situation became apparent within just a few years of his death. While Catholic institutions struggled to pretend that Galileo had never existed, Protestant scholars were elevating him to the status of a scientific martyr, whose persecution proved the superiority of their approach to knowledge. The trial that was supposed to demonstrate papal authority over dangerous ideas had instead created a powerful symbol of institutional resistance to scientific progress. Every Protestant university that taught Galilean mechanics was implicitly criticising Catholic obscurantism. In England, the Royal Society was founded in 1660 with an explicit commitment to the experimental method that Galileo had pioneered. Members conducted investigations into everything from atmospheric pressure to the behaviour of light, always emphasising careful observation and mathematical analysis over reliance on ancient authorities. The Society's motto, nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it, could have served as Galileo's personal creed during his years of challenging Aristotelian orthodoxy. Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, represented the ultimate vindication of the approach to natural philosophy that had cost Galileo his freedom. Newton's mathematical description of universal gravitation explained not just the motion of planets and comets, but also the behavior of projectiles and pendulums that Galileo had studied so carefully. The synthesis was breathtaking in its scope, demonstrating that the same mathematical laws governed motion throughout the universe, from falling apples to orbiting moons. But Newton was careful to acknowledge his debt to the Italian master, whose work had made such discoveries possible. In his famous letter to Robert Hooke, Newton wrote that if he had seen further than others, it was by standing on the shoulders of giants. Galileo was clearly one of those giants, the man who had first demonstrated that mathematics could unlock the secrets of physical motion with unprecedented precision. Without Galilean mechanics, there could have been no Newtonian synthesis. The gradual rehabilitation of Galileo's reputation within Catholic territories took much longer and proceeded with painful slowness. Individual scholars began quietly incorporating his insights into their work while avoiding direct mention of his name or explicit challenge to his condemnation. Jesuit mathematicians, despite their institution's role in his persecution, found his methods too useful to ignore completely. They developed elaborate intellectual gymnastics to separate his mathematical techniques from his astronomical conclusions, using his physics while rejecting his cosmology. This selective appropriation created absurd situations where Catholic professors would teach students how to calculate projectile trajectories using principles discovered by a man they were forbidden to name or honour. Universities throughout the Papal States found themselves in the uncomfortable position of relying on methods developed by someone their own institution had condemned as a heretic. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable, but institutional pride made acknowledgement of the contradiction impossible. Meanwhile, Galileo's personal story was being transformed into legend through countless retellings that emphasized different aspects of his life and character. Protestant writers portrayed him as a heroic defender of truth against religious tyranny, emphasizing his courage in the face of persecution. Catholic apologists tried to minimize his significance or argue that he had been justly punished for arrogance and disobedience rather than scientific insight. Secular philosophers used his example to argue for the separation of natural philosophy from theological authority. Each retelling shaped public understanding of what the Galileo affair meant for the relationship between science and religion. The actual complexity of the historical situation was gradually simplified into competing narratives that served different ideological purposes. The nuanced reality of a brilliant but politically naive scientist who miscalculated the forces arrayed against him was replaced by more dramatic stories of either heroic martyrdom or justified punishment that better served contemporary debates about authority and knowledge. The scientific revolution that Galileo had helped initiate continued accelerating throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. His emphasis on mathematical description of natural phenomena became the foundation for all subsequent physics. His insistence on experimental verification of theoretical claims established standards of evidence that transformed how investigators approach problems in natural philosophy. His demonstration that careful observation could reveal universal laws governing physical processes inspired generations of researchers to look beyond surface appearances toward underlying mathematical relationships. The telescope, that simple tube of lenses that had revealed the true structure of the solar system, continued evolving into increasingly powerful instruments that extended human vision far beyond what Galileo could have imagined. Astronomers discovered new planets, mapped the surfaces of distant worlds, and began cataloguing the countless stars that filled the universe. Each discovery vindicated his fundamental insight that direct observation, rather than ancient authority, should be the ultimate arbiter of truth about the natural world. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Galileo's legacy was methodological rather than substantive. He had created a new way of investigating nature that combined mathematical reasoning with controlled experimentation in ways that previous generations had never systematically attempted. This approach proved so powerful that it gradually displaced older methods based on logical argument from accepted premises or appeal to classical authorities. The scientific method that emerged from his work became the foundation for all subsequent advances in human understanding of the physical world. The transformation was not merely technical, but philosophical, involving fundamental changes in how people thought about knowledge itself. Where previous generations had assumed that truth was best discovered through logical analysis of established principles, the new science demonstrated that nature herself was the ultimate authority. Mathematical relationships, revealed through careful observation, were more reliable than the most elegant theoretical arguments. This shift in epistemology had implications far beyond natural philosophy, eventually influencing approaches to politics, economics, and social organization. By the early 18th century, the intellectual landscape of Europe had been fundamentally altered by ideas that could be traced directly back to Galileo's work. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, evidence, and systematic investigation owed enormous debts to the method he had pioneered. Philosophers like Voltaire explicitly invoked his example when arguing for intellectual freedom and opposition to traditional authority. The very concept of progress, so central to modern thinking, was partly based on the demonstration that human understanding could advance through systematic investigation rather than mere preservation of ancient wisdom. The man who had died as a condemned heretic under house arrest was gradually being recognized as one of the architects of the modern world. His insights about motion and mechanics had made possible the Industrial Revolution's mechanical innovations. His astronomical discoveries had expanded human awareness of the universe's true scale and complexity. His methodological contributions had established the foundation for all subsequent scientific investigation. The cosmic drama that had begun with a curious young man timing pendulum swings in a cathedral had ultimately transformed civilization itself. Yet even as his influence spread throughout European culture, the Catholic Church remained reluctant to acknowledge its error in condemning him. Official rehabilitation would not come until 1992, when Pope John Paul II finally admitted that the Church had been wrong to prosecute Galileo for his astronomical views. The 350-year delay spoke volumes about institutional resistance to admitting mistakes, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that the condemned heretic had been right about the fundamental structure of the cosmos. The final irony of Galileo's story is that the man who spent his life studying motion ultimately achieved a kind of immortality through the perpetual motion of his ideas through human culture. Every student who learns that objects fall at the same rate regardless of weight, every engineer who calculates the trajectory of projectiles, every astronomer who studies the moons of Jupiter, every physicist who applies mathematical analysis to natural phenomena is participating in a tradition that began in a villa outside Florence, where a blind old man continued questioning the universe until his final breath. The cosmic drama that had cost him his freedom and reputation had ultimately liberated human understanding from the constraints of ancient authority and religious dogma. Galileo Galilei had died in obscurity and official disgrace, but his ideas had achieved escape velocity, breaking free from earthly persecution to begin their own eternal journey through the infinite space of human knowledge and imagination. The story of Galileo Galilei, that extraordinary life that spanned nearly 8 decades of revolutionary discovery and bitter persecution, reveals something profound about the nature of human progress itself. Here was a man who began his career as a university professor teaching conventional mathematics and ended it as the architect of an entirely new way of understanding the physical world. The journey from that first observation of a swinging lamp in Pisa Cathedral to the final manuscripts hidden away at Arcetri represents more than just one brilliant individual's achievements. It represents humanity's painful transition from a universe governed by ancient authority to one revealed through observation and mathematical reasoning. What makes Galileo's story so compelling is not just the scope of his discoveries, though these were indeed revolutionary. It is the human drama of a mind that could not stop questioning, even when questioning became dangerous. Throughout his life, we see the same pattern repeated: curiosity leading to investigation, investigation leading to insights that challenged conventional wisdom, and those insights creating conflicts with established power that he never fully learned to navigate successfully. His early work on motion at Pisa showed this pattern clearly. Where others simply accepted Aristotelian teachings about falling bodies, Galileo felt compelled to test these ideas through actual observation. The resistance he encountered from colleagues was not merely academic disagreement, but something far more threatening to those invested in traditional ways of understanding the world. When you demonstrate that accepted wisdom is wrong about something as fundamental as how objects fall, you implicitly raise questions about what else might be wrong in the entire edifice of inherited knowledge. The telescope years revealed the same dynamic on a cosmic scale. Galileo's observations of Jupiter's moons, the phases of Venus, and the rough surface of our own moon did more than just provide new astronomical data. They shattered the fundamental assumption that Earth occupied a unique position at the center of creation. This was not simply a technical correction to ancient astronomy, but a complete reimagining of humanity's place in the universe. No wonder the implications terrified those whose worldview depended on the old certainties. The trial and condemnation that followed represented the inevitable collision between two incompatible approaches to truth. The Inquisition was defending a system where established authority, backed by centuries of tradition and divine sanction, determined what could be accepted as real. Galileo represented the emerging view that nature herself, investigated through careful observation and mathematical analysis, should be the final arbiter of truth about the physical world. Neither side fully understood that they were fighting about far more than astronomy. They were determining whether human knowledge would continue to be constrained by institutional authority or would be free to follow evidence wherever it led. The tragedy of Galileo's later years lies not in his forced recantation, painful though that must have been, but in the waste of extraordinary talent caused by institutional fear of new ideas. Here was perhaps the most brilliant scientific mind of his generation, reduced to conducting secret research under house arrest, forbidden from pursuing the astronomical investigations that had made him famous. The Church's victory was Pyrrhic at best, silencing one man, while ensuring that his ideas would spread far beyond their ability to control. Yet there is also something deeply inspiring about how he used those years of confinement. Rather than descending into bitterness or abandoning intellectual work entirely, Galileo turned his attention to the foundations of physics itself. The insights about motion and mechanics that emerged from his final period would prove even more influential than his astronomical discoveries. In losing the freedom to study the heavens, he gained the focus necessary to understand the mathematical laws governing all physical motion, from falling stones to orbiting planets. This brings us to perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Galileo's legacy: how completely his approach to investigating nature has triumphed over the alternatives. Today, no serious person would argue that the proper way to understand planetary motion is through logical analysis of ancient texts rather than mathematical modelling based on careful observation. The experimental method that cost Galileo his freedom has become so fundamental to how we approach knowledge that we can barely imagine alternatives. And so we close the extraordinary story of a man who dared to look up at the night sky and see truth rather than tradition. Galileo Galilei's journey from that curious boy timing pendulum swings to the blind astronomer dictating his final insights teaches us something profound about the price and power of human curiosity. His telescopes may have gathered dust, his freedom may have been stripped away, but the ideas he unleashed continue their eternal orbit through human consciousness, inspiring every generation that follows to question, to observe, and to never stop reaching for the stars. The universe he revealed to us remains as vast and wondrous today as it was 4 centuries ago, waiting for the next curious mind, brave enough to challenge everything we think we know.